All right, this week we're going to be continuing our discussion of the nervous system. So we'll start by kind of continuing the discussion we had last week about some of the ways that the nervous system is organized. And then we will get into talking a little bit more about cool stuff like the brain later on and how the brain is organized. But like I said, I wanted to start by sort of picking up on where we talked about, where we left off last week. So last week we talked about the fact that nervous tissue consists of two types of cells, right? So you have a small percentage that are going to be the neurons that actually generate and spread the electrical signals. And we talked a lot about neurons last week. We talked kind of in passing about the other type of cell, which are the neuroglial cells or just glia. Those three terms all mean the same thing, unfortunately. What we didn't talk about is the fact that glial cells are divided up themselves into several different categories. So I wanted to start out this week talking a little bit more in depth about the different types of glial cells that exist and what their specialized functions are. So the first one I wanted to talk about is one we actually did very briefly mention last week, and this is what are called Schwann cells. So Schwann cells are pictured here. And Schwann cells are going to be the cells that in the peripheral nervous system, so in the nervous system outside the brain and the spinal cord, they are going to form myelin, which again, we discussed last week is going to help to accelerate the transmission of electrical signals down axons. Within the central nervous system, we have several subtypes of glial cells, which I'm going to talk about now. The first one is going to actually have the same function as Schwann cells of forming myelin, but is going to do it within the central nervous system. So these are cells called oligodendrocytes. So they're pictured in blue here. So oligodendrocytes, essentially, they're shaped a little bit differently, but they essentially fill the same exact function as Schwann cells do in the peripheral nervous system, but oligodendrocytes are going to be found within the brain and in the spinal cord. The next type of CNS myelin I wanted to talk about is CNS glial cells are cells called astrocytes. So that's these large sort of brownish cells here. They get their name from the fact that they kind of look like stars. So that prefix astro means star. And astrocytes are going to have a very interesting function. You can see here that they are going to come in contact with neurons, but they also come in contact with capillaries within the brain. So they're actually going to have the function of covering up the capillaries somewhat and making it so that capillaries in the brain and in the spinal cord are going to be much less leaky than capillaries that you have everywhere else in your body. So there's a good reason for this. The central nervous system is going to contain large numbers of neurons. Central nervous system neurons are really delicate, so they can be very easily damaged by chemicals that might in other parts of your body not be super damaging. And the central nervous system neurons are also characterized by having a very limited ability to heal themselves from injury. That's why if somebody has a brain injury or a spinal cord injury, oftentimes it will produce lasting effects that the person will never be able to fully recover from. So we have evolved this structure called the blood-brain barrier that is created by astrocytes basically blocking capillaries from being able to release everything that ordinarily would be able to easily leak out of capillaries in the rest of the body. So this is a protective measure. It's to prevent any harmful substances in the blood from getting into the brain, getting into the spinal cord, and perhaps injuring our cells, which is good. But the blood-brain barrier does have some drawbacks. Particularly, it creates a challenge whenever people want to develop medications that they want to be able to deliver within the brain or within the spinal cord. For example, if you had a drug that you wanted to use to treat a brain disorder like Parkinson's disease, or if you wanted to deliver a chemotherapy drug to the brain to treat a brain tumor, oftentimes medications just can't get past this blood-brain barrier. The astrocytes just won't let the drug get in. So it can be a barrier in terms of that. Sometimes the way that you get around to that might be directly injecting the drug into the brain, or it might involve developing the drug in a form that can get through the blood-brain barrier through some sort of chemical modification. But it is difficult to get therapeutic agents into the blood because of this protective function of astrocytes forming the blood-brain barrier. And that's not the only thing that astrocytes do. They're also going to have a lot of ion channels and pumps, and they help to create a favorable chemical environment around neurons. So we talked last week about the fact that neurons are really sensitive to the ions in their extracellular fluid that can affect their likelihood to fire and action potential. So astrocytes play a big role in making sure that the chemical environment around a neuron is correct and that there's no harmful substances getting near those CNS neurons. Okay. So one of the things that actually can't cross the blood-brain barrier is white blood cells. And so this leaves your brain and spinal cord without the use of the cells that carry out most of the immune function in the rest of your body. So luckily, we have another type of glial cells that are called microglia. These are these little things that kind of look like snowflakes here. So microglia, interestingly, have taken on the role as they basically act like an immune system within your central nervous system. And they live in your central nervous system all the time, so you don't have to worry about them getting across the blood-brain barrier. But that creates something of an immune system within our central nervous system. And then finally, the last type of glial cells that I want to talk about are these ependymal cells, these cells up here. So these cells are going to line the surface of the brain. You can see here, this is the edge of the brain, and this is a fluid-filled space within the brain, so there's no cells in here. And what they do is they have these little motile cilia that move. And they are going to play a function in helping to circulate what's called cerebrospinal fluid, which is going to be a blood-like but not blood fluid that exists within the central nervous system. And because of this limited ability for blood to transport substances within the brain has developed its own little mini circulatory system, the brain and spinal cord, that uses this cerebrospinal fluid to transport chemicals within the CNS. So the cilia on the surface of the ependymal cells are going to be really important for helping that fluid to circulate, because the blood circulation, we have a heart pumping the blood. We don't have any kind of muscular pump driving the circulation of the cerebrospinal fluid. So that's where the ependymal cells come in. These motile cilia help keep the CSF moving. Okay. To talk a bit more about the organization of the nervous system, this is going to be a review for you guys that the central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system consists of everything else. But last week I didn't talk about the fact that you can further divide up the PNS into several smaller divisions. So the peripheral nervous system is going to consist of some what are called sensory neurons. The term, so again, I apologize, the nervous system is the absolute worst in terms of having multiple terms that mean the same thing, but you will also see sensory neurons referred to as afferent neurons. So sensory neurons are involved in sensing. So they're going to send information from the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system. And then you're going to have the opposite of sensory neurons, which are motor neurons. And they are also referred to as efferent neurons. So you can maybe see the reason why I prefer to use sensory and motor rather than afferent and efferent, because they mean the opposite, but they sound almost exactly the same. But people do use these terms, afferent and efferent. But motor neurons mean neurons that send information from the CNS to the rest of the body. And then the motor neurons can be further broken down into what's called the somatic motor division. That's going to be motor neurons that will control our skeletal muscles, which are our voluntarily controlled muscles. And then the autonomic division. So the way I always remember this is autonomic kind of sounds like the word automatic. So the autonomic division is going to control tissues that we control involuntarily, right? So your skeletal muscles, you decide that you want to move them, right? I'm gonna move my arm, right? I'm going to produce speech using my face and my respiratory muscles. So that's all part of the somatic motor division. But the autonomic division is going to control all of your involuntary muscles. So your smooth muscle, your cardiac muscle. So that includes things like opening up blood vessels, controlling your heart rate. The autonomic division is also going to control exocrine glands that secrete things like digestive enzymes and sweat onto the surface of your body. Some endocrine glands are also controlled by the autonomic division. Some adipose tissue, some fat tissue that secretes substances is going to be controlled by the autonomic division. And then there's also an entire branch of the nervous system called the enteric nervous system, which is going to control the organs of digestion. So we're not even really going to get into that in this course, but you have this entire additional set of neurons that controls your digestion that's very complicated, but that's under the autonomic division. Okay. So then further, the autonomic division can be divided up into two major branches. So these branches are called the parasympathetic division and the sympathetic division. Sometimes people refer to them as the parasympathetic branch and the sympathetic branch. And again, that means the exact same thing. So what the parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions refer to is the fact that most of the autonomic tissues in your body, so most of the involuntary tissues in your body, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, etc., most of them are going to receive feedback. They're going to be controlled by neurons that are both so you're going to have some parasympathetic neurons and some sympathetic neurons, both talking to the same tissue. So you'll see here, this divides up the function of neurons that are part of the parasympathetic division and neurons that are part of the sympathetic division. And you'll see if you look at this table that the things on the left are pretty much the opposite of the things on the right. Okay, so you have this competing control. So you're going to have some parasympathetic neurons talking to the pupil of the eye, and when they're active, they will constrict the pupil of the eye. And then you have another population of neurons that when they are active, that are part of the sympathetic division, they will dilate the pupil of the eye. They'll make it bigger, okay? So usually when the parasympathetic division is active, the sympathetic division is going to be inactive, and the opposite happens as well. That when the sympathetic activity goes up, parasympathetic activity will go down. So the sympathetic division is often referred to as your fight or flight responses. So it is going to be activated under conditions of stress generally. The parasympathetic division is going to be activated under what are called rest and digest conditions. So this is when you are not responding to an emergency. The parasympathetic branch tends to kind of regulate things like, so rest and digest, obviously that includes digestion, so digestive enzymes and digestive function. Basically, the parasympathetic division is going to promote things like restoring your body during times when you're not under stress. So it's going to do things like slowing your heart down, promoting the emptying of your bladder, all this like kind of self-maintenance stuff that is not going to be a priority under these stressful conditions when you're dealing with an emergency. So the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches are generally going to control the same tissues, but produce opposite effects on those tissues. All right. I then wanted to talk a little bit about reflexes since we're talking about automatic functions of the nervous system. So the word reflex is probably a word that you've heard of before, and you probably have some vague sense of what it means. So it's usually a fast and involuntary response to a stimulus, right? So the kind of classic example is you put your hand on something that's burning hot and you yank it back. And that happens before your brain even realizes that you've touched something really hot. So reflexes can be divided up into two major categories. So there are what's called autonomic reflexes that are going to involve the autonomic nervous system, and they're going to involve tissues that are always controlled involuntarily. So an example of this would be you eat food, and in response to the food entering your small intestine, what's going to happen is digestive enzymes are going to get released from the pancreas. Okay, so that's tissues that you're not ever able to do that voluntarily. It's always automatic. So it's always going to occur via a reflex. What we usually think of when we think of a reflex, and the example I gave you of yanking your hand back from a hot stove, is what's called a somatic reflex. So these are going to be reflexes that involve the somatic motor division. So they're going to involve skeletal muscles, which under normal conditions are controlled voluntarily. But under the conditions of a reflex, they are going to be controlled involuntarily. That yanking your hand back from a hot stove, you're not deciding to do that. That's happening before you've even realized what is happening. So that's the difference between autonomic reflexes, which involve tissues that are always involuntarily controlled. Somatic are going to involve tissues that normally are voluntarily controlled. Okay, so autonomic reflexes, although we are less aware of them because they happen automatically, are really important for homeostasis. So at the very beginning of the semester, when we first started talking about anatomy and physiology, we talked about some of the ways that we adapt to changes in our environmental temperature. And a lot of that is going to be brought about by autonomic reflexes. So if you go into a warm environment, you might feel thirsty, you might sweat, you might move blood into the tissue tissues that are closest to the surface of the body. So all of that is going to be mediated by autonomic reflexes. So tissues that are always automatically controlled, and they're going to be responding to a stimulus, in this case, high temperature. So this is just one example. A lot of our homeostatic regulation is going to be governed by autonomic reflexes. Okay, so that brings us to talking a little bit more about somatic reflexes. So these are the responses that are going to involve tissues that normally are controlled voluntarily. So why, in the case of a somatic reflex, are these tissues suddenly controlled involuntarily? Well, the answer is that somatic reflexes are going to be governed by neurons, sensory neurons, bringing information into the body. So it's going to come through a nerve that is going to have a sensor in the muscle that's going to be involved in this. So it's going to send a message and say, hey, somebody just hit us with a hammer. And so normally this information about being hit with a hammer, right, would go all the way up to the brain, and eventually it will, right? Eventually you will be aware that the doctor has hit you in the leg with a hammer. But what happens here is that as soon as the information gets to the spinal cord, what's going to happen is that these sensory neurons are going to communicate directly with motor neurons that control movement, and they are going to trigger the motor neurons contracting and kicking in response to being hit with the hammer. So eventually this message will make it up to the brain that you got hit in the leg, but by the time that happens, you will have already responded with your muscles by kicking in response to this. So a somatic reflex, the reason why we are not voluntarily aware of it, the reason why we're not making a decision, is because the integration is happening at the level of the spinal cord rather than making it all the way to the brain where we have our conscious ability to make decisions.